Good morning. Racing, great books. We are excited. Our guest today is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Our guest today is the author, Michael E. Sawyer. We'll be discussing his new biography, Sir Lewis. It's about the legendary Formula One driver, Lewis Hamilton. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
So, what was Lewis Hamilton's life like growing up in England?
Yeah, so Lewis came from, what's best described as kind of humble upbringing, right? He grew up in Stevenage, which is outside of London, so he wasn't a person from a big city. He's his dad and mom got divorced early, but there was never any situation where they both weren't kind of really involved in his life, particularly his father. And early on, he had a real interest in cars, so it started with radio control cars. Then when that worked out with him doing really well in like the British RC model championship series, he moved over to karting, which he'd wanted to try as a kid. So his dad had to take on a couple of different jobs, et cetera, to kind of make sure he had the money to keep him in karting. So that was the big barrier to him at the very opening of the sport. And also, obviously Lewis is the first black driver ever in F1. So there were kind of social tensions around him joining the sport at the very beginning as well. He talks about that were difficult for him to navigate.
So it sounds like though, growing up with the entry level versions of racing, he always had a strong performance.
Yeah, absolutely. It was from the very beginning. It's difficult to imagine, right? When you have a kid who's 6 or 7 years old who can drive a remote control car, having never ever driven a car. So obviously then he could project himself into what, the kind of forces that act on the car at that point, right? So I think that's part of what has made Lewis such a great driver over his career is he can translate that information to mechanics, engineers, et cetera, that will never actually be in the car themselves. So I think part of that came from being able to understand kind of those spatial dynamics and acceleration braking at a very early age before like I said, before he'd ever actually even driven a car.
Nice. How were you able to get such great access to sources close to Lewis Hamilton?
It's just you just write letters, you write email, you stay after it. He has a very tight group around him. So, and they operate very closely. So it's not a situation where you can ever get official records because they just want to keep him, at some distance. I think, obviously to me, I think that makes a lot of sense because I think Lewis, from his perspective, at this stage of his career, the kind of notion of a biography is a little early for that, right? Because he wants to kind of finish out everything. But what I want to do is look at what had happened to him up until the point of in 2021 at the end of that season is where I really became interested in kind of trying to produce a project. I had no idea that he would end up leaving Mercedes. So what happened in this book is it basically brackets his entire career and gets us to the point where he leaves, heads for Ferrari. So I think it's a good space to pause, kind of take stock of that aspect of his career, both on and off the track. So I had really good access to Mission 44, which is his foundation where he talks about where they are prepared to talk about and have a lot of information about what he's up to kind of worldwide with questions of STEM education, diversity in STEM and all these kinds of places and trying to get more diversity in motorsports.
Wow, that is phenomenal. Um, why is Lewis Hamilton the greatest Formula One driver of all time?
So I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves, right? He's won over 100 Grand Prix. He's been on pole position more than 100 times. There's no one close to that at this stage of the game. I think his level of consistency across different permutations of the car technically, right, has proven that he's able to kind of adjust. He's had, difficult competition, right? He came in his first team with McLaren. He was competing against Fernando Alonso, who was a two-time world champion at the time. Then obviously there was a kind of Sebastian Vettel era at Red Bull where Seb was, at the top of the sport. Then obviously when he got to Mercedes, competing against Nico Rosberg was difficult. And now you see what happened in those years with him having to compete against Red Bull and Max Verstappen. All that's going on. I think Lewis's willingness to take chances is part of that, both on the track, like in races, and chances within a particular boundary. Lewis is not known as a dirty driver or a driver that you can't compete with kind of wheel to wheel. I think that's positive. And then we start talking about everything that he's done off the track, which to me, and dealing with the adversity that we talked about at the beginning, all those things set him up as having achieved as more than most drivers. Only the only person he's tied with is Schumacher as far as world championships, but also in a position to have achieved or overcome other types of obstacles that other drivers didn't have to deal with.
Do you feel it would have been interesting if Schumacher and him would have their careers would have overlapped? Do you think that would have been really exciting?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely would. If Schumacher had been still at the top of his game and Lewis at the top of his, I think it would have been an interesting kind of situation to deal with that. And that's just, that's how the world works, right? These eras come and go and drivers come and go. What's really unfortunate with Schumacher is after his skiing accident, he's not been in a position to be able to comment on what's happening. But before he was injured, he was clear about saying that he viewed Lewis Hamilton as a person who could basically break his record for the number of world championships, right? So he could see it, kind of early on. So, and Schumacher is an iconic kind of figure as well, right? Somebody that has to be considered in this conversation about the greatest of all time, which is always complicated. But yeah, it would have been super interesting to see those two compete against one another at the top of their game.
Is Lewis Hamilton's single-minded determination what makes him so great?
Yeah, I think it's that. I think he's able to focus his attention when it's necessary, right? So Lewis is one of the few athletes who have, as many complicated interests off the field as they do on it, right? But at the same time, he's able to focus on each one of them individually. So I think that kind of point of focus and compartmentalization makes him a different driver. I think his ability to kind of overcome adversity and also preserve resources. One thing you'll hear a lot about Lewis is how he's always been able to mitigate tire wear better than most drivers, right? I think that really comes down to when he was a kid and didn't have money to kind of just throw at tires, right? He had to take care of his resources. And so I think that has played itself out all the way through his career. So all those things are important. Obviously, drivers have to be fearless, right? I mean, he's got that gene. And also, the season's very long. A lot of drivers can win a couple of races, but to be able to string together race after race, week after week, to maintain that level of performance is really complicated with everything that happens during the season. So all those things are, make him unique. And obviously the, world-class eye hand coordination and reaction time is just, off the charts for him.
Of his 7 championships, which one certified him as a global superstar?
So I think when he got to Mercedes after he left McLaren, so we can even go back, right? I think his first one probably certified him as a global superstar because as a rookie he only lost a championship by 1 point, right? So that would have been unprecedented for someone to come into the sport and basically take it over. And so that entire 2007 season that was supposed to be about the kind of resurgence of Ferrari with Kimi Räikkönen over there and also what was going to happen with Fernando Alonso showing up at McLaren to try to pad his because he'd already had 2 world championships. That was supposed to be the story that year, right? But all of a sudden, after Australia, the very first race, where Lewis was kind of at the very front of the grid, all of a sudden, the story became Lewis Hamilton from that point forward. And that was pretty much a European story until he came to America and he won his first race in Canada, and so then came to the U.S. And I think the U.S. we were still running Formula One and Indy at that point, right? So then he was kind of known on both sides of the Atlantic then. So that was 2007. So then the question then naturally becomes whether that was a fluke or not, right? Because a rookie comes in, nobody really understands his driving style, anything can happen. Then in 2008 to win the championship, I think at that point it was certified that there was the potentiality that you were looking at an era that he would be defined by, right? That would be defined by that driver. The down years at McLaren after that, but then when he shifted to Mercedes and started winning championship after championship, it just kind of kept padding and padding his stats and also his kind of worldwide regard for him as a driver.
I mean, it feels like his 7 championships are what make him the all-time great in Formula One. But I really feel that what caused him to become Sir Lewis and get knighted has more to do with off the track.
I think that's right. He obviously it's a great story for Britain with a person from kind of that upbringing and making it all the way to that level, right? To get to Formula One, this, as I mentioned before, is almost impossible. But then to get there and actually be the best driver, and coming from a background where people didn't expect it to happen, kind of is a great story for Great Britain, right? Uh, but what he cares about, like social justice stuff, is really something that he took a big risk in 2020 on that, and I think it paid off for him. And he did what he felt was the right thing by taking up the cause of Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, et cetera, with police violence in this country. So that makes him a global kind of person who cares, right? Because he's from England. England has its own problems, right? But he still has the time and wherewithal to care about what's happening in Kentucky or Minneapolis or these places where he may never have been, right? So I think that's true. I think his emphasis on the environment is important, and also what he says about diversity in sport, whether it's for drivers, mechanics, engineers, marketing people, ownership. He cares about all of that, right? And across the board, it's not just race, it's ethnicity, it's gender, it's all those things. So then you have what he does in fashion, which is also another whole realm. Then the last thing, he's an owner in sports, right? He owns part of the Denver Broncos. So you have a person who has this kind of incredible portfolio that he cares about. So I think, to be a peer and to become a knight in that way is about all of that at the same time. But his platform is definitely Formula One.
He feels that he is one of the few global athletes that really do care about social justice. Um, why is that he is one of the few to be able to do that?
So I think Lewis is unique, and I think Muhammad Ali is probably the most important person or most accurate kind of point of comparison. Where for Ali, his stance in the 1960s cost him the most productive years of his career, right? When he was protesting the Vietnam War and lost his license, those were the years where Ali would have been at the very top of his sport. And he still became a global icon even after that with these difficult years we had to come back, and his career went longer than it should have because of the loss of those years, I would imagine, right? What Lewis has done is advocate for things from, as he is also the superstar in the sport, and he didn't take any losses from it that would be apparent or ones that anybody would care about, right? There are people who didn't want to market with Lewis Hamilton because of his stance on police violence. It's hard to tell who they might be, right? So that makes him unique, and some of it too, James. I think to your point, right? A lot of athletes would like to take a stance on things, but they simply can't find a point of attention or time to do it because the sport takes up. It's a full time job, right? And Lewis apparently is able to maintain at least 4 or 5 different full time jobs from the last time I can count, right, across everything he's doing. So I think that speaks to his kind of energy level and also shows that he really cares about these things because it's not just something to do for photo opportunities because it takes a lot of energy, time, money, all those kinds of things.
And on top of all that, I really feel that his biggest contribution is how he's inspired that next generation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that is will be the long term legacy of Lewis Hamilton. I think in these moments, particularly in the 2021 season, where he had suffered that terrible call by the race steward that cost him his eighth world championship, right? When he gets out of the car and walks over and congratulates Max Verstappen the way he should, and then shows up at the podium and celebrates this other person's championship when he knows that it was stolen from him. And when he talks about that in the aftermath, that was about kids. He said, he thought about himself as a kid and what he would have wanted a champion or a hero like him to do. And it's not throw your helmet off and kick the side of the car or storm out and refuse and give some scathing kind of remark and talk about the illegitimacy of the race. He was bigger than that moment at that point, right? And I think that is a lesson. If you want to teach a kid how to be a great winner and loser at the same time, and that's the example that you want to hold up. And I think that's unique in sports because a lot of times, and we can understand that, right? Like athletes get frustrated, everybody gets frustrated. In my job, I get frustrated. But the question is, how can you always elevate that? And I think it's a great example for kind of culture generally.
Excellent. Michael, it has been a pleasure having you on the show today talking about your new biography, Sir Lewis. Uh, Before we let you go, we're on social media, we're on the web. Where can we find out more about you and your book?
Yeah, so the book is available pretty much everywhere. You can't miss it. It's at, all the online booksellers, and if you have a local bookstore in your community that you want to support, if they don't have it, ask them to get it because, we don't have enough local bookstores that are still in the game. So I'm really a huge advocate of that. So, just find the book, and I really appreciate the support of it, and thanks for having me on your platform.
Welcome. It was my pleasure. Have a great day.
You too.